Carl Jung, Why Being Misunderstood Means You're Closer to Wholeness. Jung discovered something that still terrifies the psychological establishment today. It wasn't about mental illness. It wasn't about childhood trauma. It was about the people who don't fit. The ones who are chronically, maddeningly, inexplicably misunderstood by everyone around them. And here's what makes this discovery so dangerous. Jung found that these people aren't broken at all. They're becoming whole in a world designed to keep everyone fragmented. Let me be direct with you. If you've spent your entire life feeling like no matter how clearly you explain yourself, people just don't get you. If your family looks at you like you're speaking a foreign language, if your friends nod but you can see the confusion in their eyes, if you've started to wonder whether you're crazy or everyone else is asleep, Jung would say you're not experiencing a psychological problem. You're experiencing an initiation. This isn't about poor communication skills. It's not about social anxiety or neurodivergence, though those might be present. This is about something far more unsettling. You've begun integrating parts of yourself that the collective psyche has spent centuries trying to repress. And the collective doesn't misunderstand you because you're explaining yourself poorly. It misunderstands you because understanding you would require it to confront everything it's refused to see about itself. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming psychologically whole. But what he rarely emphasized in his public writings, what he saved for his private clinical notes and the cryptic passages of his Red Book, is that this journey almost always begins with a specific type of suffering, the agony of being perpetually, profoundly misunderstood, not just occasionally misread, not just having your words twisted, but fundamentally existentially unseen by the people you're trying hardest to reach. Here's the forbidden part that Jung whispered only to his closest students. This misunderstanding isn't an obstacle to your wholeness. It's a diagnostic sign that you're approaching it. Think about what that means. Everything you've been taught says that psychological health equals social integration, that wellness means being understood and accepted by your community. The entire mental health industrial complex is built on helping people fit in better, communicate more effectively, reduce their otherness. But Jung discovered the opposite. He found that the people closest to genuine wholeness, not the performance of wellness but actual psychological integration, were almost universally misunderstood by their families, their cultures, their times. Why? Because wholeness requires integrating what the collective has exiled. It requires becoming conscious of what society needs to remain unconscious. It requires speaking truths that make people uncomfortable, embodying paradoxes that violate binary thinking, living with complexity that the collective psyche flattens into simplistic narratives. You become incomprehensible not because you're lost, but because you've found something the collective isn't ready to see. Jung experienced this himself with devastating intensity. When he broke with Freud in 1913, he wasn't just losing a mentor. He was losing his entire professional identity, his community, his sense of being understood by anyone. The psychoanalytic world labeled him a mystic, a traitor, possibly psychotic. For 6 years, Jung descended into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period so isolating, so misunderstood even by his own wife, that he questioned his sanity daily. He had visions of Europe drowning in blood. He conversed with inner figures who seemed more real than the people around him. He painted strange symbols and wrote in a book no one would see for decades. Everyone thought he was having a breakdown, but Jung was actually having a breakthrough into a dimension of psyche that had no language, no map, no precedent in Western psychology. He was individuating in a world that had no concept for what individuation even meant. And when he emerged, he brought back a message that still makes people uncomfortable. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And becoming who you truly are will make you incomprehensible to almost everyone you know. This video is for those of you standing at that threshold. You've tried everything to make yourself understood. You've refined your communication, sought therapy, questioned your sanity, maybe even medicated yourself into submission. You've contorted yourself into shapes you thought would finally make sense to others. And still, you remain unseen. What if that's not the problem? What if that's the initiation? What if the universe is using your chronic misunderstanding as a crucible, forcing you to develop a relationship with yourself so deep that others' perception becomes irrelevant? What if you're being called to a form of wholeness that doesn't require external validation because it contains its own authority? This is the journey we're about to explore, the paradoxical path from misunderstood to whole. It's not a journey of learning to fit in better. It's a journey of learning to stand so firmly in your own integrated truth that being misunderstood becomes irrelevant. But I need to warn you, this path is dangerous. Jung documented case after case of people who started down this road and ended up in inflation, paranoia, or complete withdrawal from the human community. The line between individuation and isolation is razor thin. The difference between becoming whole and becoming grandiose is often invisible until it's too late. So we're going to walk this path carefully, examining not just the promise but the pitfalls. We're going to look at those who succeeded and those who failed. We're going to explore Jung's own near-psychotic descent and miraculous integration, and we're going to give you the actual tools, not the motivational platitudes, but the specific Jungian practices that can transform your misunderstanding from wound into initiation. If you're ready to stop exhausting yourself, trying to be understood, and start the far more difficult work of understanding yourself, stay with me. If you're willing to entertain the possibility that your otherness isn't a bug but a feature, that your differentness isn't pathology but the beginning of psychological wholeness, then this video was made for you. The question isn't whether you'll continue being misunderstood. If you're on the individuation path, you will be. The question is whether you'll let that misunderstanding destroy you or initiate you. Let's find out which one you're choosing. Let me describe something you may have experienced so many times you've stopped even trying to articulate it. You're having a conversation with someone you care about, a family member, a partner, a friend. You're trying to explain something that matters deeply to you, not something abstract or complicated, something simple about how you see the world, what you value, what you're experiencing, and halfway through you see it. That look, the glaze in their eyes, the slight confusion, the polite nodding that tells you they've stopped trying to follow you and are just waiting for you to finish. So you try again. You rephrase. You use metaphors. You pull back, simplify, try to find common ground. And somehow it gets worse. They respond to something you didn't say. They argue against a point you never made. They summarize your position in a way that's so far from what you meant that you wonder if you spoke out loud at all. And then comes the worst part, the part that makes you question everything. They tell you they understand. They pat your hand. They offer advice based on their complete misinterpretation of what you just said. And you realize they genuinely believe they understood you. There's no malice here. They're not deliberately misrepresenting you. They literally cannot perceive what you're trying to communicate. It's like you're speaking in a frequency they can't hear. Now, let me be clear about what we're not discussing here. We're not talking about poor communication skills that can be fixed with better articulation. We're not talking about temporary misunderstandings that resolve with patience and clarity. We're not even talking about the normal friction of different perspectives. We're talking about something far more profound and far more unsettling, a chronic fundamental disconnect between your inner experience and others' perception of you that persists despite your best efforts. your emotional intelligence, your willingness to meet people where they are. Jung had a term for this. He called it the crisis of the differentiated individual in an undifferentiated collective. But let me translate that into the lived experience. This is what it actually feels like. You walk through the world as a translator between two languages, your internal language and the collective language everyone else speaks, and you're the only one doing the translating. Everyone else assumes you speak their language, just badly. They don't even realize there's a translation happening. So when you try to express your authentic experience, one of three things happens. First possibility, they pathologize you. Your depth becomes overthinking. Your sensitivity becomes being too emotional. Your complexity becomes making things complicated. Your refusal to participate in surface-level interaction becomes being difficult or having issues. Second possibility, they romanticize you. You become the intense one, the deep one, the spiritual one, which sounds like a compliment but actually puts you in a box that others can feel comfortable with. They've categorized you, which means they don't have to actually understand you. They can just relate to their idea of what someone like you must be like. Third possibility, and this is the most painful, they simply don't see you at all. They project onto you what they need you to be. The family member who needs you to be successful projects ambition onto you, even if that's not your driving force. The friend who needs you to be stable projects calmness onto you, even when you're falling apart. The partner who needs you to be their fantasy projects that fantasy so strongly that your actual self becomes invisible. And here's what makes this crisis so psychologically destabilizing. You start to doubt your own reality. You think, if no one else experiences the world this way, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm making things up. Maybe my inner experience isn't valid. This is the moment Jung warned about, when the invalidation becomes internalized, when you begin to gaslight yourself, when you start performing a version of yourself that others can understand but isn't actually you. Jung called this the provisional life. It's the life you live while waiting for your real life to begin. The provisional life is built entirely on maintaining social acceptance and avoiding the discomfort of being misunderstood. In the provisional life, you learn to dim your light so others don't feel inadequate, simplify your language so others don't feel stupid, hide your depth so others don't feel shallow, fake certainty so others don't feel uncomfortable with your paradoxes, perform normalcy so others don't feel disturbed by your otherness. And the cruelest part? The provisional life works. People understand the false self you've created. They're comfortable with it. They reward you for it. Your family finally relaxes around you. Your colleagues can categorize you. Your friends stop looking confused. But you're dying inside. Because maintaining the false self requires constant vigilance. You have to monitor everything you say for potential misunderstanding. You have to translate in real time, constantly censoring your authentic responses and replacing them with acceptable ones. You have to live in permanent self-consciousness, always aware of the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be. The psychological cost is devastating. Jung documented it repeatedly in his clinical practice. The symptoms appear as chronic exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix because you're exhausted from performing. Depression that seems to have no cause because the cause is self-abandonment. Anxiety that therapy can't resolve because the anxiety is your psyche screaming that you're living a lie. Physical symptoms, migraines, digestive issues, chronic pain, because the body rebels against what the mind is forcing it to do. And underneath all of it, a persistent existential question that haunts you in quiet moments. Is this all there is? Did I miss something? Is everyone else experiencing a dimension of life I can't access? Or am I experiencing a dimension they can't perceive? Let me give you some data that validates what you're experiencing. Because one of the cruelest aspects of this crisis is feeling like you're the only one. You're not. Studies on authentic self-expression and psychological well-being consistently show that congruence between inner experience and outer presentation is the strongest predictor of life satisfaction, stronger than income, stronger than relationship status, stronger even than physical health. But here's what's disturbing. The same studies show that authentic self-expression often decreases social approval, at least initially. Research on highly sensitive people, about 20% of the population, shows that they process sensory and emotional information more deeply than others. Their brains literally work differently. They pick up on subtleties others miss. They feel the emotional undercurrents in rooms. They sense the unspoken tensions. And when they try to articulate what they're perceiving, others often can't verify it because they're not perceiving it. So the highly sensitive person learns, my reality isn't trustworthy because no one else experiences it. Studies on creative individuals show similar patterns. People with high openness to experience, high creative achievement, and high cognitive complexity report feeling chronically misunderstood by peers and family members. Why? Because they see connections others don't see, possibilities others can't imagine, meanings others don't perceive. Their way of processing reality is fundamentally different. And here's perhaps the most validating research. Studies on what psychologists call self-differentiation, the ability to maintain your authentic self while staying in relationship with others, show that it's the marker of psychological maturity. But achieving it requires a painful intermediate phase where you feel profoundly isolated because you're no longer fusing with others, but haven't yet found your true community. Jung understood this better than almost anyone. He recognized that chronic misunderstanding isn't a social skills deficit. It's an existential position. It's what happens when someone begins to individuate, to become psychologically whole, in a collective that remains fragmented. The collective psyche operates on certain agreements. Don't feel too deeply. Don't think too complexly. Don't see what we've all agreed not to see. Don't speak what we've all agreed not to speak. Don't embody paradoxes we need to keep separated. Don't be so yourself that it reminds us we're not being ourselves. When you violate those agreements, not rebelliously, but simply by being who you actually are, you become incomprehensible. Not because you're communicating poorly, but because what you're communicating threatens the collective's carefully maintained illusions. This is the crisis we're addressing, not the problem of being occasionally misunderstood, not the challenge of different communication styles, but the profound existential crisis of living in a persistent state of disconnect between your inner truth and others' perception, knowing that to be truly seen would require others to see things about themselves they're not ready to face. And here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This crisis isn't a detour from your path. This crisis is your path. The pain of being chronically misunderstood is the pain of the chrysalis. Uncomfortable, confining, seemingly endless, but actually the necessary pressure that transforms you from one form of life into another. The question is, will you treat this crisis as a problem to be solved by making yourself more understandable? Or will you recognize it as an initiation into a deeper relationship with your own psyche? Because here's what Jung found in case after case. The people who tried to solve the crisis by becoming more understandable to others eventually collapsed. They abandoned their authentic selves so completely that they developed severe psychological and physical symptoms. But the people who used the crisis as a catalyst for going deeper into their own integration, they emerged transformed, not understood by everyone, but no longer needing to be, not fitting in perfectly, but no longer trying to, not comprehensible to the collective, but deeply comprehensible to themselves and to the few others walking the same path. This is the fork in the road where you're standing right now, and before you can choose your direction, you need to see what both paths look like when lived fully. Let me show you. In 1928, a young woman arrived at Jung's consulting room in Zurich. Let's call her Anna, though Jung always protected his patients' identities in his published work. Anna was 26 years old, from a prominent intellectual family in Vienna. Her father was a respected professor of philosophy, her mother from minor aristocracy, two brothers both successful in conventional careers, and Anna, the family mystery, the one no one could quite figure out. She came to Jung with what her family physician called nervous exhaustion and what her family simply called Anna's difficulties. The symptoms were severe, debilitating migraines, insomnia punctuated by intensely vivid dreams, periods of depression so profound she couldn't leave her bedroom, and what she described as attacks, moments when she felt she was drowning or suffocating despite being in a safe environment. Her family had tried everything, rest cures that didn't cure, tonics that didn't help, long vacations to the countryside where she only became more agitated. 3 different physicians had suggested it might be hysteria, that fashionable diagnosis for women whose inner lives exceeded what the culture could comprehend. But when Anna sat in Jung's office and began to speak, something else emerged. Not hysteria, something far more interesting and far more painful. Anna was, quite simply, different from her family in almost every fundamental way. Where they were rationalists who trusted only logic and empirical evidence, she experienced the world through symbol, intuition, feeling. Where they valued social propriety and philosophical debate, she valued inner truth and authentic connection. Where they lived comfortably in the world of ideas, she lived in a world of emotional and spiritual depth they couldn't even perceive. And she had spent her entire life trying to translate herself into their language. Let me share what Jung discovered in her journals, which she brought to their sessions. Page after page of attempts to explain herself to her family. How do I make father understand that I'm not being irrational when I follow my intuition? How do I explain to mother that my need for solitude isn't coldness but self-preservation? How do I tell my brothers that their success in the world feels hollow to me without them thinking I'm judging them? And then, more desperately, perhaps I am defective. Perhaps there is something wrong with my mind that I cannot simply accept the world as they see it. Perhaps I am hysterical, as the doctors suggest. Perhaps my inner experiences are delusions and I should trust their reality instead of my own. This is what Jung called the wound of invalidation, and he recognized it immediately because he had experienced it himself. But here's what made Anna's case so instructive. She had developed elaborate coping mechanisms that Jung recognized as both brilliant and destructive. She had learned to translate her experiences into language her family could accept. When she had spiritual experiences, she would describe them as philosophical insights. When she felt emotional truths, she would frame them as logical conclusions. When she sensed undercurrents in family dynamics, she would remain silent because speaking them would label her as too sensitive or making things up. She had become a master translator, and it was killing her. Jung asked her a question that she later said changed everything. What if the problem isn't that you're not explaining yourself clearly enough? What if the problem is that explaining yourself clearly would require them to see things about themselves they cannot yet see? Anna didn't understand at first, so Jung continued. Your father's rationalism, what do you think it's protecting him from feeling? Your mother's focus on propriety, what depth is she avoiding by staying on the surface? Your brother's conventional success, what inner questions are they not asking by pursuing external validation? and slowly Anna began to see it. Her mystical experiences threatened her father's worldview that everything could be explained through reason. Her emotional depth threatened her mother's carefully constructed persona of aristocratic composure. Her refusal to pursue conventional marriage and social status threatened her brother's choices by presenting an alternative they had never considered. She wasn't being misunderstood because she was communicating poorly. She was being misunderstood because understanding her would require her family to confront their own shadow material, the parts of themselves they had repressed, denied, projected onto others. Her father had repressed his own intuition and spiritual longings, channeling everything into intellectual achievement. Her mother had repressed her emotional needs and authentic desires, living entirely through social expectations. Her brothers had repressed their own doubts and deeper questions, achieving success while avoiding self-examination, and Anna, by simply being herself, by refusing to repress what they had repressed, was holding up a mirror they desperately needed not to look into. This realization was simultaneously liberating and devastating for Anna. Liberating because it meant she wasn't crazy. Her inner experiences were valid. Her perceptions were accurate. She had been sensing real dynamics that others were choosing not to see. But devastating because it meant they might never understand her, not because she wasn't explaining herself well enough, but because understanding her would require them to question everything they'd built their lives on. And most people will choose to misunderstand you rather than question their entire worldview. Jung worked with Anna for 3 years, and the transformation wasn't what her family hoped for. It wasn't Anna learning to calm down or think more rationally or stop being so sensitive. It was Anna learning to stop abandoning herself for the comfort of others. The process was excruciating. Jung had her do something radical. Stop translating. Stop trying to make herself understandable to people who couldn't understand her. Stop performing the version of herself that put them at ease. For several months, Anna barely spoke to her family, not out of anger or rejection, but because she realized that almost every interaction had become a performance. She didn't know how to be with them as her authentic self because she had no practice doing so. During this time, her symptoms initially got worse. The migraines intensified. The dreams became more vivid and more disturbing. She dreamed repeatedly of being underwater in a vast ocean, or of being in foreign cities where no one spoke her language, or of standing before her family while they looked through her as if she were made of glass. Jung recognized these dreams as the psyche's symbolic language. The underwater dreams represented being submerged in the unconscious, diving beneath the surface world her family inhabited. The foreign cities represented her authentic self's foreignness to her family's world. The transparency represented how invisible she had become in her efforts to be seen. But Jung did something crucial. He taught Anna to speak to her dreams, to engage with them through what he called active imagination, to dialogue with the symbolic figures, to ask them what they wanted, to let them express what her conscious mind couldn't articulate. And slowly, something shifted. Anna began developing her own symbolic vocabulary, through painting, through private ritual, through keeping a journal that wasn't trying to explain herself to anyone, but was simply witnessing her own inner experience. She stopped needing her family to validate her reality because she was learning to validate it herself. The breakthrough came during what Jung later wrote about as a powerful synchronicity. Anna had been working on a painting, abstract symbols and figures that represented her inner world. She hadn't shown it to anyone, wasn't painting for exhibition, was creating purely for her own integration. One afternoon, a visiting colleague of Jung's happened to see the painting in Anna's apartment. The colleague was a scholar of medieval mysticism, and he immediately recognized the symbols Anna had painted. symbols from mystical texts she had never read, had never seen, had no conscious knowledge of. This moment validated something profound for Anna. Her inner experiences weren't random, weren't pathology, weren't made up. They were connecting her to what Jung called the collective unconscious, the deep symbolic realm that exists beneath individual consciousness. She wasn't crazy. She was tapped into something real that her rationalist family had no framework for understanding. The final phase of Anna's work with Jung involved a careful, painful process of differentiation, not cutting off from her family but establishing clear psychological boundaries, learning to say without defensiveness or aggression, "I understand you see it differently. I understand you don't share my experience. I'm not asking you to. I'm simply being truthful about mine." This sounds simple. It was agonizing. Every time she stated her truth, without trying to justify it or make it understandable to them, she had to tolerate their confusion, their concern, sometimes their anger. She had to watch them misinterpret her, without immediately trying to correct the misinterpretation. She had to let them be uncomfortable with her. Jung documented that the first time Anna successfully did this, she came to their next session and said, "I finally understand what you've been trying to teach me. My job isn't to make them understand me. My job is to understand myself so deeply that their misunderstanding becomes irrelevant." By the end of her work with Jung, Anna's symptoms had dramatically improved. Not because her family finally understood her. They didn't. Her father still considered her overly mystical. Her mother still worried about her lack of conventional marriage prospects. Her brothers still couldn't comprehend why she'd turned down a perfectly suitable match to pursue her own inner work. But Anna no longer needed them to understand. She had found a small but profound community, a group of women artists in Vienna who shared her depth, a mentor and a retired Jungian analyst, a spiritual practice that fed her soul. She had stopped trying to live in her family's world and had begun creating her own. And paradoxically, once she stopped needing to be understood, she could actually be present with her family without the constant undercurrent of pain. She could love them without needing them to perceive her. She could maintain connection without fusion, separation without cutoff. She had achieved what Jung considered the goal of individuation, becoming truly oneself while remaining in relationship, not by making everyone understand you, but by understanding yourself so profoundly that external validation becomes unnecessary. Years later, Jung would write about Anna's case in his notes on individuation. He wrote, "The patient arrived believing she was sick because she couldn't make herself understood. She left understanding that her symptoms were not illness, but the psyche's rebellion against the unlived life. What we called her nervous condition was actually her self's refusal to accept the false existence her family required of her." This is what chronic misunderstanding often is. Not a communication failure, but the self's rebellion against self-betrayal. Your symptoms aren't problems. They're your psyche screaming that you're living a lie. And the cure isn't learning to communicate better. It's learning to stop abandoning yourself for others' comfort. Anna's story represents the pattern Jung saw over and over. The crisis of misunderstanding is the birth canal of individuation. It's painful, it's isolating, it feels like you might not survive it. But if you stay with it, if you go deeper instead of performing more convincingly, it transforms from wound into initiation. But here's what Jung also knew. For every Anna who made it through this process, there were others who didn't. Others who got lost in inflation or withdrew completely, or collapsed back into the provisional life, or never found the tools to navigate the transformation. So before we go further, we need to understand what makes the difference. Why do some people use misunderstanding as a portal to wholeness, while others get destroyed by it? Let's look at what modern psychology has discovered about this process. Jung's insights about the misunderstood individual weren't just clinical observations or mystical intuitions. Modern psychology and neuroscience have spent the last several decades proving he was right and discovering why. Let me show you what science now knows about the relationship between authentic self-expression, social misunderstanding, and psychological wholeness, because understanding the mechanism makes the path less terrifying. First, the validation. Multiple longitudinal studies on authenticity and well-being have found something that should be shouted from rooftops, but rarely is. Your psychological well-being is predicted far more strongly by the congruence between your inner experience and outer expression than by how accepted or understood you are socially. A landmark study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology followed over 2,000 individuals across 15 years. Participants who scored high on authenticity measures, meaning their behavior aligned with their inner values and experiences, even when it created social friction, reported significantly higher life satisfaction, lower anxiety and depression, better physical health, and more meaningful relationships than those who prioritized social approval. But here's the crucial finding that Jung would have recognized immediately. The authentic group was not more socially accepted, especially in the early phases of their authenticity. They reported more social conflict, more confusion from family members, more periods of isolation. Yet their psychological health remained significantly higher. Why? Because the human psyche apparently has a built-in betrayal detector. When you abandon your authentic self for social acceptance, your nervous system registers it as a threat. Not a threat from others, but a threat from yourself to yourself. Neuroscience is now showing us the mechanism. Studies using fMRI brain imaging have found that when people act inconsistently with their authentic values and self-concept, even in small ways, even when no one else knows, it activates the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, the same region involved in processing physical pain and social rejection. Your brain literally experiences self-betrayal as pain, which means chronic self-betrayal, living the provisional life, performing the false self that others can understand, creates chronic pain, not metaphorical pain, actual neurological pain. This explains something Jung observed clinically, why his patients with the most mysterious physical symptoms often had the least visible external problems. They weren't being abused or traumatized in obvious ways. They were being subtly, persistently invalidated, and their bodies were rebelling. Now let's talk about the differentiation research, because this is where things get really interesting. Murray Bowen's family systems theory introduced the concept of differentiation of self, the ability to maintain your own beliefs, values, and emotional responses while remaining emotionally connected to others. Bowen found that most people operate at one of two extremes: fusion or cutoff. Fusion means you can't maintain your authentic self when others disagree. You abandon your position to maintain harmony. Cutoff means you can't stay connected while maintaining your authentic self. You have to completely sever relationships to be yourself. But differentiation, the ability to say, I understand you see it differently, and I'm going to maintain my own position without needing you to change yours. This is the marker of psychological maturity, and it's excruciating to develop. Why? Because when you start differentiating, you trigger anxiety in everyone around you. You're violating the unspoken family or social system rules. You're introducing complexity where simplicity felt safer. You're being yourself in ways that remind others they're not being themselves. Bowen's research showed that when one family member begins to differentiate, the system will instinctively try to pull them back. Through guilt, through concern, we're worried about you. Through pathologizing, you've changed, you're not yourself. Through ultimatums. The system doesn't do this maliciously. It does it automatically because systems seek homeostasis. This is why Anna's family couldn't understand her. Understanding her would have required them to differentiate too, to question their own choices, to face parts of themselves they'd repressed. Easier to see her as the problem than to examine their own provisional lives. Now here's where it gets even more validating. Research on cognitive and sensory processing differences. We now know that approximately 20% of people have what's called high sensory processing sensitivity. Their nervous systems are literally wired to process information more deeply, pick up on subtler cues, feel emotional and physical stimuli more intensely. Psychologist Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people shows they have measurable differences in brain activation. When shown emotional images, their brains show more activity in areas associated with awareness, empathy, and processing. They're not too sensitive. They're accurately sensitive to information that others' nervous systems filter out. Imagine what this means for communication. A highly sensitive person walks into a room and picks up on emotional tensions, unspoken conflicts, subtle body language, tonal variations that others don't consciously register. When they try to articulate what they're perceiving, others often can't verify it because they're not perceiving it. So the highly sensitive person learns, my reality isn't shared. When I speak my truth, others look confused or concerned. The safest thing is to stop trusting my perceptions and start trusting the collective's perceptions instead. This is how you gaslight yourself, not because you're crazy, but because you're accurately perceiving information that the statistical majority filters out. Similar patterns appear in research on high openness to experience, one of the 5 major personality traits. People high in openness see connections others don't, possibilities others can't imagine, meanings others don't perceive. They think in analogies, metaphors, symbols. They live comfortably with ambiguity and paradox. Studies show that high openness correlates strongly with creativity, intellectual achievement, and, you guessed it, feeling misunderstood by peers and family. When you see the world through a wider aperture, you see things others literally cannot see. And when you try to share what you see, it sounds to them like you're making things up. Now, let me introduce you to one of the most important pieces of research for understanding the misunderstood to wholeness journey, Kazimierz Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. Dabrowski was a Polish psychiatrist who studied highly gifted, creative, and sensitive individuals. He made a discovery that got him into serious trouble with the psychological establishment. He found that many symptoms we label as mental illness or maladjustment are actually signs of advanced psychological development. He proposed that psychological growth doesn't happen through smooth integration. It happens through disintegration, the breaking down of earlier, simpler structures to make room for more complex, more authentic integration at a higher level. The person appears to be falling apart. Their old coping mechanisms stop working. They question everything they previously accepted. They can't maintain the false self anymore. They feel anxious, depressed, lost. Everyone around them is concerned. They might get diagnosed with depression, anxiety disorders, or even mild psychosis. But Dabrowski argued this positive disintegration is actually the psyche reorganizing at a higher level of complexity. The old structure was too small to contain who they're becoming. It has to break down before a more authentic, more integrated structure can emerge. This is exactly what Jung was describing with individuation, but Dabrowski provided the developmental framework. He identified 5 levels of development, with most people never moving past level 2. Level 2 is living by socially conditioned values, doing what you're supposed to do, being who others expect you to be. The transition to level 3 requires disintegration. You start questioning the shoulds. You start feeling the gap between your authentic self and your performed self. You start being unable to maintain the provisional life, even though you don't yet know who you actually are. This transition looks like crisis to everyone around you, and it feels like crisis to you. But it's actually development. You're not regressing, you're decomposing to recompose. Dabrowski found that people going through positive disintegration are almost always misunderstood by their communities. They're told to get it together, to go back to how you were, to stop overthinking. But going back would mean stopping their development, freezing themselves at a level of consciousness that no longer fits. Research on this theory has found that individuals who successfully navigate positive disintegration share certain characteristics. They have access to creative outlets. They find mentors or communities who understand the process. They develop a capacity to tolerate intense internal conflict without acting out or shutting down. And crucially, they're willing to be temporarily misunderstood while they figure out who they're becoming. Now, let's talk about the research that makes all of this even more urgent. Studies on conformity, groupthink, and collective consciousness. Because Jung wasn't just concerned with individual wholeness, he was terrified of what happens to societies where no one individuates. Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments in the 1950s showed something disturbing. When faced with a group consensus that contradicted their own clear perception, 75% of participants conformed to the group at least once, even when the group was obviously wrong. Think about what this means. 3/4 of people will deny what they're clearly seeing if everyone else claims to see something different. They'll gaslight themselves rather than stand alone in their perception. More recent research has refined this understanding. Studies show that conformity increases when the issue seems subjective or ambiguous, when the person feels uncertain, when social bonds are at stake, when the group is unanimous. All conditions that are present when you're trying to express complex inner experiences to people who don't share them. But here's the most important finding. The minority who don't conform aren't socially defiant or oppositional. They're not trying to be different. They're simply unable to deny their own perception, even at social cost. They have what researchers call high perceptual independence. These are the people Jung identified as potential individuators, not rebels trying to stand out, but individuals who cannot abandon their authentic perception even when it isolates them. And research on group dynamics shows why this is so valuable. Groups without dissenting voices make worse decisions. They fall into groupthink, confirmation bias, collective blind spots. The person willing to say, actually, I'm seeing something different, serves the group by preventing collective delusion. But here's the tragedy. That person gets labeled as difficult, negative, not a team player. The very individuals who could prevent collective catastrophe get pushed out of the collective. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the danger of mass movements and collective possession. Without individuated individuals who can resist the collective's trance, societies can descend into madness, while everyone insists everything is fine. Studies on whistleblowers, organizational dissidents, and truth-tellers show a consistent pattern. They report chronic misunderstanding before they speak out. They see things others aren't seeing. They feel compelled to say something, and when they do, they're almost always initially dismissed, pathologized, or ostracized. But longitudinal studies show something fascinating. They also report higher self-integrity, less regret, and often better long-term outcomes than those who saw the same problems but stayed silent to maintain belonging. The research on authentic living versus performed living is stark. Studies tracking people across decades find that those who prioritize being understood and accepted over being authentic show higher rates of midlife crisis, depression, substance abuse, and what researchers call mortality salience. increased awareness of death and meaninglessness. Meanwhile, those who prioritize authenticity over acceptance, who tolerate being misunderstood while remaining true to themselves, show higher rates of what psychologists call eudaimonic well-being, not just happiness, but meaning, purpose, psychological growth, and what Maslow called self-actualization. This isn't just correlation. Experimental studies have tested this. When researchers ask people to act inconsistently with their values for just a few days, they show measurable increases in anxiety, depression, physical symptoms, and negative self-evaluation. When asked to act consistently with their values, even when socially awkward, they show increases in self-respect, sense of meaning, and psychological resilience. Your psyche knows when you're living authentically, and it rewards or punishes you accordingly. Now let me share perhaps the most validating research for anyone on this journey. Studies on what psychologists call self-concept clarity. This is the degree to which your beliefs about yourself are clearly defined, internally consistent, and stable over time. People with high self-concept clarity report higher well-being, lower anxiety, better decision-making, and more satisfying relationships. But here's what's counterintuitive. They also report being misunderstood more frequently than people with low self-concept clarity. Why? Because when you have a clear, well-defined sense of self, you notice when others perceive you inaccurately. When your self-concept is vague and malleable, you don't notice misunderstanding because you're not sure what the accurate understanding would be. So the pain of being chronically misunderstood might actually be a sign that you're developing a clearer, more integrated sense of self. You're noticing the gap because there's finally something substantial enough to gap away from. Research on identity development shows that adolescents and young adults go through a phase called identity moratorium, a period of exploration and crisis before consolidating their identity. During this phase, they're frequently misunderstood by parents, peers, and even themselves because they're in flux. But some people go through a second, deeper identity moratorium in their 30s, 40s, or beyond. This is when they realize the identity they consolidated was built on others' expectations rather than authentic self-knowledge. They have to go back through the crisis phase, this time with more at stake: careers, relationships, reputations built on the false self. Researchers call this identity reconstruction, and it's one of the most challenging psychological processes adults face. And it almost always involves a period of profound misunderstanding as the person dismantles who they pretended to be and discovers who they actually are. Finally, let me share research that explains why this process matters beyond individual well-being. Studies on cultural evolution and collective consciousness. Sociologists studying how cultures change over time have found that transformation almost always begins with individuals who violate cultural norms, not rebelliously, but authentically. They're not trying to change the culture, they're trying to be themselves. But in doing so, they introduce new possibilities, new ways of being, new consciousness that wasn't available before. The culture initially rejects them. They're misunderstood, marginalized, sometimes persecuted. But if enough individuals hold their ground, if they integrate rather than collapse or inflating, they eventually shift the collective consciousness. What was incomprehensible becomes comprehensible. What was threatening becomes possible. Every social movement, every cultural evolution, every expansion of human consciousness has followed this pattern. It begins with individuals willing to be misunderstood while they live a truth the collective isn't ready to see. Jung understood this. He wrote, "The individual is the carrier of life. In the end, the individual is the only one who can bring about a change in the collective." But he also warned, the individual who tries to change the collective without first changing themselves will only add to the collective's problems. This is why individuation matters, not just for your personal well-being, but for the evolution of human consciousness. When you individuate, when you integrate your shadow, when you become whole, you don't just heal yourself. You introduce new possibility into the collective psyche, but you have to be willing to be misunderstood while you do it. You have to develop a relationship with yourself so solid that others' inability to comprehend you doesn't make you abandon your path. This is what the research is telling us. The pain of chronic misunderstanding isn't evidence that something's wrong with you. It's evidence that you're developing something the collective doesn't yet have language for. It's evidence that you're integrating complexity, that the collective still keeps split. It's evidence that you're becoming whole in a world that rewards fragmentation. The question isn't whether you'll be misunderstood. If you're individuating, you will be. The question is whether you'll use that misunderstanding as a reason to abandon yourself or as a catalyst to go deeper into yourself. Because here's what Jung and modern research both confirm. On the other side of this painful process is something the culture desperately needs, but rarely mentions: an integrated human being. Someone who's done their shadow work, who can hold paradox, who doesn't need external validation because they've developed internal authority. And the world doesn't have enough of these people. It has plenty of people who fit in. It has plenty of people who perform wellness while falling apart inside. What it lacks is people who've actually become whole. But becoming whole requires walking through the fire of misunderstanding without letting it consume you. And to do that, you need to know what type of fire you're walking through. Let me show you the different faces this initiation wears. Not all misunderstanding looks the same. Jung understood that the psyche expresses itself through archetypes, universal patterns of experience that manifest in individual ways. If you're being called to individuation through chronic misunderstanding, you're likely expressing one or more of these archetypal patterns. Recognizing your pattern helps you understand not just what's happening, but what your psyche is trying to accomplish through it. Let's explore the 5 archetypal faces of sacred misunderstanding. See which one or which combination reflects your experience. Type 1. The mystic misunderstood spiritual experience. You've had experiences that don't fit into the materialist worldview. Maybe you've had moments of unity consciousness, where the boundary between self and other dissolved. Maybe you've had precognitive dreams that came true. Maybe you've sensed presences or energies that others dismiss as imagination. Maybe you simply experience life as inherently meaningful, synchronistic, infused with something numinous that you can't prove but can't deny. And when you try to share these experiences, you get one of several responses. Eye rolls from skeptics who dismiss anything that can't be measured. Concerned looks from family members who worry you're becoming too woo-woo. Religious friends who try to fit your experiences into their doctrine, missing the actual texture of what you encountered. New Age enthusiasts who romanticize your experiences without understanding their weight and complexity. The mystic archetype is perhaps the most lonely because you're experiencing dimensions of reality that the dominant culture has spent centuries trying to erase. Western civilization's commitment to rationalism, materialism, and empiricism means there's no cultural container for mystical experience except as entertainment, pathology, or religious dogma. Jung himself was a mystic who spent decades trying to make his experiences acceptable to the scientific community. He had visions. He heard voices. He experienced what he called the reality of the psyche, the understanding that inner experiences are as real as outer events, just operating in a different domain. But he could never fully communicate this to his colleagues. Even those who respected him thought he'd gone too far, become too mystical, abandoned science for spirituality. They didn't understand that for Jung, mysticism wasn't abandoning reality. It was perceiving more of reality than materialism allows. If you're the mystic type, your core wound is, my deepest experiences are labeled as delusion, fantasy, or psychological compensation by the culture I live in. You start to doubt your own experiences. Maybe you are making it up. Maybe it's just neurons firing. Maybe you're deluding yourself. But here's what Jung discovered. The psyche produces mystical experiences when consciousness needs to expand beyond its current limitations. Mystical experiences aren't regression to childish magical thinking. They're progression toward more complex integration of reality. Your gift, mystic, is that you're perceiving dimensions of existence that the collective has repressed. You're accessing what Jung called the collective unconscious, the deep symbolic realm that connects all human experience. Your experiences aren't personal pathology. They're the psyche showing you that reality is far more mysterious, more symbolic, more meaningful than the culture admits. But your danger is inflation. Because mystical experiences are so powerful, so numinous, it's easy to identify with them, to believe you're chosen, enlightened, special, to develop a subtle superiority toward those who don't see what you see. This inflation destroys the integration process because it separates you from humanity rather than deepening your connection to it. Your individuation challenge is this. Can you honor your mystical experiences without identifying as a mystic? Can you receive the gifts of the numinous without claiming ownership of them? Can you remain humble while experiencing the extraordinary? The integrated mystic becomes what Jung called the wounded healer, someone who's been to the depths, experienced the numinous, and returns to serve others without claiming superiority. Not a guru demanding followers, but a guide pointing toward the mystery while admitting they don't fully understand it themselves. Type 2, the truth speaker, misunderstood authenticity. You cannot lie, not just about big things, but about small things. You can't pretend to enjoy conversations you find meaningless. You can't fake enthusiasm for activities that bore you. You can't perform the social niceties that lubricate human interaction. When someone asks, "How are you?" you actually tell them, not realizing it's a rhetorical greeting. When you're in a meeting discussing a strategy you think is flawed, you have to say so, not understanding why everyone else is nodding along. When someone shows you their work and asks what you think, you give honest feedback, not realizing they wanted validation. People call you brutally honest, too blunt, lacking tact. They tell you not everything needs to be said, that sometimes kindness is more important than truth, that you need to learn when to keep your thoughts to yourself. And you genuinely don't understand. To you, lying, even white lies, even polite lies, feels like a violation of something sacred. Truth isn't just a value for you, it's a moral imperative, an existential necessity. You'd rather be alone with your integrity than connected through deception. The truth speaker archetype aligns with what Jung called the prophet or the sage, the one who sees clearly and cannot stay silent, even when silence would be safer. In mythology, this is Cassandra, cursed to see the truth but never be believed. In literature, it's the child who points out the emperor has no clothes, while adults pretend not to notice. If you're the truth speaker, you've likely experienced profound confusion about why others are comfortable with the gap between what they say and what they mean, between what they present and what they actually feel. You've probably been told you're on the spectrum, that you don't understand social cues, that you're too intense. But here's what Jung would say. The problem isn't that you don't understand social cues. It's that you're responding to deeper cues, the energetic truth beneath the performed presentation. You're reading the actual feelings beneath the polite words. And when you respond to the truth rather than the performance, others feel exposed. Your core wound is, my honesty is labeled as cruelty, my authenticity as aggression, my inability to lie as social dysfunction. You start to wonder if something is wrong with you. Maybe you should learn to be more tactful. Read dishonest. Maybe you're being selfish by prioritizing truth over others' comfort. But your gift is invaluable. You're holding space for authenticity in a culture drowning in performance. You're refusing to participate in the collective agreement that we all lie to each other to maintain comfort. You're modeling what it looks like to live without a false self. Systems need truth speakers. Families need someone who will name the dysfunction everyone's pretending not to see. Organizations need someone who will point out the strategy isn't working before catastrophe hits. Cultures need individuals who will speak truths that are collectively repressed. But your danger is contempt. When you see clearly and others won't look, when you speak truth and others prefer lies, it's easy to develop disgust for human dishonesty, to see others as weak, cowardly, fake, to withdraw into isolation with your integrity intact, but your humanity diminished. Your individuation challenge is this: can you speak truth without requiring others to accept it? Can you honor authenticity without contempt for those still learning? Can you be honest without being cruel, direct without being superior? The integrated truth speaker becomes what Jung called the sage, someone who speaks truth with compassion, who names what is without shaming those who aren't ready to see. Not a self-righteous prophet condemning the sleeping masses, but a clear-eyed witness inviting others into more authentic relating while accepting their current capacity. Type 3. The creative deviant. Misunderstood originality. Your mind works differently. You see connections others don't, possibilities they can't imagine, solutions that violate existing categories. Where others see A or B, you see C through Z. Where others think linearly, you think in networks, spirals, multidimensional maps. You're the artist whose work doesn't fit any gallery's existing aesthetic. The entrepreneur whose business idea seems insane until years later, everyone's doing it. The scientist whose hypothesis violates current paradigms. The writer whose voice is so unique that publishers don't know how to market it. People tell you you're too creative, unrealistic, impractical. They say things like, "That's interesting, but have you considered doing it the normal way?" They want you to tone down your originality, fit into existing boxes, be revolutionary, but only within acceptable parameters. The creative deviant archetype is the artist, the magician, the innovator, the one who brings into existence what didn't exist before. In mythology, this is Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. In history, it's every visionary who saw what was possible before it became actual. If you're the creative deviant, you've experienced the painful gap between your vision and others' comprehension. You see the finished cathedral while others see a pile of stones. You hear the symphony while others hear noise. You feel the potential while others see only impracticality. And you've probably been told to be more realistic, to think about practical limitations, to stop dreaming and focus on what's actually possible. Which is soul-crushing because what's actually possible for others feels like a cage to you. Your core wound is, my vision is dismissed as fantasy, my originality as impracticality, my creativity as an inability to accept reality. You begin to doubt your own perceptions. Maybe you are being unrealistic. Maybe you should focus on what exists rather than what could exist. Maybe creativity is just avoiding responsibility. But Jung understood something crucial about creative individuals. They're not avoiding reality. They're perceiving potential reality, the unrealized possibilities latent in the present moment. They're accessing what he called the creative unconscious, the source of genuine novelty. Your gift is that you're bringing new consciousness into the world. Every innovation, every work of art, every revolutionary idea started as incomprehensible vision in someone's mind. You're the vehicle through which the new enters reality, but your danger is either inflation or collapse. Inflation, believing your vision is so special that you're above the mundane work of actualizing it, becoming the tortured genius too pure for practical reality. Collapse, abandoning your vision under pressure to conform, betraying your creative impulse to become acceptable. Your individuation challenge is this: can you honor your vision while developing the discipline to actualize it? Can you remain devoted to your creative truth while accepting that others can't see it yet? Can you be original without needing validation while still creating work that eventually communicates? The integrated creative deviant becomes what Jung called the magician, someone who can move between the realm of potential and the realm of actual, bringing visions into form without losing their essence. Not a fantasist living in imagination, not a conformist who's killed their creativity, but someone who creates genuinely new possibilities while staying grounded in reality. Type 4, the deep feeler, misunderstood, emotional intensity. You feel everything intensely: joy that overwhelms you, grief that levels you, love that terrifies others with its depth, anger that seems disproportionate to the trigger. You don't just experience emotions, you're flooded by them, inhabited by them, transformed by them. You walk into a room and feel the emotional atmosphere immediately. You sense tensions others claim aren't there. You pick up on people's hidden pain, their unspoken needs, their secret longings. It's not that you're particularly empathetic in an intentional way. You can't not feel what others are feeling, and people tell you you're too emotional, too sensitive, too intense. They say you're making a big deal out of nothing, that you take things too personally, so that you need to toughen up or develop thicker skin. Partners tell you your emotional depth is exhausting. Family members roll their eyes at your dramatics. Friends pull back when you express feelings they find uncomfortable. Therapists sometimes pathologize your intensity as borderline traits or mood dysregulation. The deep feeler archetype is the lover, the healer, the empath, the one who experiences the full spectrum of human emotion without numbing or defense. In mythology, this is the wounded healer, Chiron, whose own pain makes him capable of healing others. In literature, it's every character who feels too much for the world they inhabit. If you're the deep feeler, you've experienced the profound loneliness of being emotionally alone, even in relationships. Your partners can't meet you at the depth you naturally inhabit. Your family can't hold the intensity of your feeling. Your friends want lightness when you're being pulled into depth. You've probably tried to manage your emotions, control them, make them more acceptable. Maybe you've medicated them, numbed them with substances or distractions, apologized for them constantly. You've learned to say, "Sorry, I'm being too much," as a preemptive defense. Your core wound is, my emotional depth is labeled as pathology, my sensitivity as weakness, my intensity as instability. You start believing that feeling deeply is the problem, that you need to become less rather than integrate more fully. But Jung understood that deep feeling isn't pathology. It's access to the emotional layer of the collective unconscious. You're not just feeling your own feelings. You're feeling the feelings that others have repressed, the collective emotional truths that culture tries to keep underground. Your gift is profound, your emotional reality for others. You feel what they cannot let themselves feel. You cry the tears they've held for decades. You express the anger they've swallowed. You love with the depth they're afraid to access. You're doing emotional labor not just for yourself, but for the collective. But your danger is drowning. Because you feel so intensely, because others' emotions can flood you, It's easy to lose yourself in the emotional realm, to become so identified with feeling that you have no stable ground, to be tossed by every emotional wave, reactive, overwhelmed, unable to function. Your individuation challenge is this: can you feel deeply without being destroyed by feeling? Can you honor your emotional intensity while developing a container for it? Can you be sensitive without being destabilized, empathetic without losing yourself? The integrated deep feeler becomes what Jung called the healer, someone who can hold deep emotional space for others because they've learned to hold it for themselves. Not someone who's transcended emotion, but someone who's learned to be with intense emotion without being consumed by it. They become the person others seek when they need to feel deeply, to grieve fully, to love without defense. Type 5. The integrated rebel, misunderstood wholeness. This is the most paradoxical type, and it usually emerges after you've worked with one or more of the other patterns. You've integrated your shadow. You've done your inner work. You've become more whole, more integrated, more authentically yourself. And you've discovered something disturbing. Being whole makes you incomprehensible to people who are still fragmented. You're simultaneously strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, spiritual and earthy, serious and playful, disciplined and spontaneous. You contain multitudes, as Whitman said. You hold paradoxes that binary thinking can't comprehend. People literally can't categorize you. You don't fit their boxes. Conservative friends think you're too liberal. Liberal friends think you're too conservative. Spiritual people think you're too skeptical. Skeptics think you're too spiritual. Your family can't figure out if you're successful or a failure because you've defined success on your own terms. The integrated rebel archetype is what Jung called the self, the totality of the personality, the union of conscious and unconscious, the reconciliation of opposites. In mythology, this is the divine androgen, the union of masculine and feminine. In alchemy, it's the philosopher's stone, the transformation of base metal into gold. If you're the integrated rebel, you've experienced the strange isolation that comes from actually doing the work everyone claims to want. You've individuated. You've integrated your shadow. You've become whole. And it's made you more alone in some ways, not less. Because wholeness is threatening to fragmented people. Your integration reminds them of their fragmentation. Your authenticity highlights their performance. Your self-acceptance challenges their self-rejection. Your ability to hold paradox makes their black and white thinking feel insufficient. Your core wound is, my integration is seen as contradiction, my wholeness as inconsistency, my authenticity as not fitting anywhere. People keep trying to fit you into one category or another, and when you won't cooperate, they either dismiss you as confused or attack you as fake. You say you value both solitude and community, and people accuse you of not knowing what you want. You express both grief and joy about the same situation, and people tell you you're being inconsistent. You're deeply spiritual and deeply skeptical, and people say you need to pick a side. But Jung knew that psychological wholeness requires holding contradictions, not resolving them into false simplicity, but containing them in creative tension. The healthy psyche isn't pure or simple. It's complex, paradoxical, multi-dimensional. Your gift is that you're modeling what integrated humanity looks like. You're showing that it's possible to be both and rather than either or. You're living proof that shadow work doesn't make you perfect. It makes you whole, which includes your imperfection. But your danger is the most subtle of all: spiritual pride. You've done the work others haven't. You've integrated what they've kept split. It's incredibly easy to develop a quiet superiority, a sense that you're more evolved than those still in fragmentation. And the moment you fall into that trap, you've stopped individuating and started inflating. Your individuation challenge is the ultimate one. Can you be whole without claiming superiority to those who aren't yet? Can you hold your integration lightly, knowing it's a process, not a destination? Can you remain humble while embodying wholeness? The fully integrated rebel becomes what Jung rarely wrote about publicly, but hinted at in his later works, the servant of the self. Someone who's done enough work to be genuinely useful, not perfect, not enlightened, but integrated enough to serve others without unconsciously harming them. They become the elder, the guide, the presence that doesn't need to claim authority because their integration speaks for itself. Now here's what's crucial to understand. Most people are not purely one type. You're likely a combination with one or two patterns dominating. Maybe you're a mystic truth speaker who has numinous experiences and cannot lie about them. Maybe you're a creative deep feeler whose artistic vision comes through intense emotional access. Maybe you're moving from being primarily one type toward integration as the rebel. The point of these archetypes isn't to box you in. It's to help you recognize the specific shape your individuation journey is taking, because each type has different gifts, different dangers, different challenges, and each type needs to understand something critical. Your misunderstanding isn't random, it's patterned, and recognizing the pattern helps you navigate it without getting destroyed by it. But before we can talk about navigation, you need to see the real dangers, because this path kills people, sometimes literally, often spiritually. And if you don't understand the risks, you won't survive them. Let me show you what waits for those who walk this path without consciousness. Jung never romanticized the individuation journey. He saw too many casualties, patients who started down the path toward wholeness and ended in madness, isolation, or death. Being chronically misunderstood can initiate you into wholeness, but it can also destroy you. The line between initiation and destruction is thinner than most spiritual teachers admit. Let me show you the 5 deadly pathologies that await those who navigate this journey unconsciously. These aren't theoretical warnings. These are actual patterns Jung documented clinically, patterns that still destroy people today. Danger 1. Inflation and the Messiah complex. Here's how it happens. You start recognizing that you see things others don't. You perceive truths they're blind to. You feel depths they're numb to. You have experiences they can't comprehend. And slowly, subtly, you begin to identify as special. At first, it feels like healthy self-recognition. You're not broken, you're gifted. You're not crazy, you're seeing clearly. You're not too sensitive, you're appropriately sensitive to what others filter out. But then it shifts. You start thinking, I see what they can't see. I understand what they don't understand. I'm awake and they're asleep. I've done the work they're avoiding. You begin sorting humanity into categories, those who get it and those who don't, the conscious and the unconscious, the aware and the asleep, and you've placed yourself firmly in the superior category. Jung called this inflation, when the ego identifies with archetypal energy and becomes grandiose. The mystic believes they're enlightened. The truth speaker believes they're the prophet calling the masses to wake up. The creative deviant believes they're the misunderstood genius. The deep feeler believes they're more emotionally evolved. The integrated rebel believes they're further along the path. The inflated person doesn't necessarily announce their superiority. It's often more subtle, a quiet condescension, a patient tone when explaining things to normal people, a sigh when others don't get it. They might use spiritual language about being further along, or psychological language about having done more inner work. But the core belief is the same. I am special, I am chosen, I am different in ways that make me better, and this belief is absolute poison to the individuation process. Why? Because individuation isn't about becoming special, it's about becoming whole, and wholeness includes your ordinariness, your commonality with all humans, your shared participation in the human condition. The moment you identify as special because you're misunderstood, you've turned your misunderstanding into an identity, and now you have an unconscious investment in remaining misunderstood because understanding would threaten your special status. Jung watched patients sabotage moments of genuine connection because being understood destabilized their identity as the misunderstood one. He saw people reject communities that could actually see them because accepting being seen would mean releasing their inflation. The inflated person becomes addicted to their isolation. They need it to maintain their sense of specialness. They unconsciously seek out situations where they'll be misunderstood so they can confirm, "See, I'm too advanced for these people." This is how inflation destroys the journey. You started being misunderstood because you were becoming whole. You end up misunderstood because you're clinging to grandiosity. And here's the cruelest part. The inflated person genuinely believes they're humble. They say things like, "I don't judge people who aren't ready," while oozing condescension. They claim they're not superior while explaining why they see what others can't. They perform humility while embodying superiority. Jung warned that inflation is the most dangerous early stage because the person can't see it in themselves. They experience their grandiosity as simply recognizing truth, and everyone around them can see it except them. Danger 2. The wounded healer trap. This pathology is particularly seductive because it looks like integration. You've been wounded by being misunderstood. You've suffered. You've learned from your suffering. Now you want to help others who are suffering the same way. You become the wounded healer, the one who uses their pain in service of others. This is beautiful when it's integrated. It's deadly when it's not. Here's how you know you're trapped. Your entire identity is built on having been wounded. You introduce yourself through your trauma. You bond with others over shared wounds. You can talk endlessly about your pain but become uncomfortable when discussing your joy, your strength, your wholeness. You've made your woundedness your brand, your calling card, your claim to authenticity, and unconsciously, you need to stay wounded to maintain this identity. So you sabotage your own healing. Every time you're close to integration, you create a new crisis. Every time you're about to move beyond the wound, you find a new way to reopen it. Every time someone reflects back your health, you highlight your brokenness. You're not consciously doing this. You genuinely want to heal, but you've built your entire sense of self, your community, your purpose around being wounded. Healing would require becoming someone new, and that's terrifying. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. The patient who gets better then suddenly gets worse right before terminating therapy. The person who finally finds people who understand them, then pushes them away and returns to isolation. The individual who's on the edge of breakthrough then creates a catastrophe that reestablishes their familiar suffering. The wounded healer trap is particularly common among people with the deep feeler archetype. They've learned that their emotional intensity gives them access to others' pain, makes them good helpers, connects them to communities of fellow sufferers. But if they actually integrated, if they learned to be with intensity without being destabilized by it, they'd lose their identity as the sensitive one who suffers more deeply. So they keep themselves in perpetual woundedness, calling it staying open or remaining authentic to the struggle. Here's how to diagnose if you're trapped. Do you feel threatened when you're happy? Do you feel like you're betraying fellow sufferers if you heal? Do you feel most alive, most yourself when you're in crisis? Do you have more to say about your pain than your growth? If yes, you've made your wound your identity, and your psyche will keep you wounded to maintain who you think you are. The exit from this trap requires something terrifying. You have to be willing to not be special because you've suffered. You have to let your wound become just one part of your story, not the defining feature. You have to risk being ordinary, maybe even boring as you integrate. Danger. 3. Contemptuous withdrawal. This is the path of the person who's tried so hard to be understood, been rejected so many times that they develop a protective contempt for those who don't get them. It usually starts reasonably. You recognize that some people aren't capable of understanding you, and that's okay. You set boundaries. You stop trying to explain yourself to those who can't hear you. Healthy differentiation. But then it metastasizes. You start seeing most people as fundamentally lesser, asleep, unconscious, NPCs in the game of life, while you're the main character. You develop an internal hierarchy where you're operating at a level most humans will never reach. Your contempt might be quiet. You don't announce it, but it's in your tone when you talk about normal people. It's in your rolled eyes when someone says something you consider naive. It's in your internal monologue. Of course they don't understand. How could they? They've never questioned anything in their lives. This contempt feels protective. It insulates you from the pain of rejection. If you despise those who misunderstand you, their misunderstanding can't hurt you. You've armored yourself with superiority. But here's what Jung knew. Contempt is projection. When you look at others with contempt, you're actually looking at the parts of yourself you haven't integrated, the person you see as shallow. They're reflecting the part of you that longs for simplicity, that's exhausted by depth. The person you see as unconscious, they're reflecting the part of you that wishes you could just not see, not feel, not know. The person you see as conformist, they're reflecting the part of you that craves belonging, that's tired of being the outsider. Jung taught that everything we despise in others is shadow material, rejected aspects of ourselves that we've disowned and projected outward. When you feel contempt, you're not seeing others clearly. You're seeing your own rejected parts wearing their faces, and contempt destroys the very thing you're seeking. You say you want authentic connection, but you've made authentic connection impossible because you've decided most humans aren't worthy of it. You say you want community, but you've disqualified most potential community members as insufficiently conscious. The contemptuous person ends up in a prison of their own making. They're surrounded by people they consider beneath them, which confirms their isolation, which deepens their contempt, which increases their isolation. It's a death spiral. Jung documented cases where this pattern led to complete social withdrawal. The person ends up alone, convinced it's because no one is capable of understanding them, never recognizing that they've made themselves incapable of connection through their contempt. The most tragic part? Often the contemptuous person was right at first. They were genuinely more conscious, more sensitive, more aware than those around them. But instead of using that awareness in service of compassion, they used it as a weapon of judgment. And over time, their contempt actually made them less conscious, because consciousness requires humility, curiosity, willingness to see your blind spots. Contempt closes you off from learning anything from those you've deemed inferior. I've seen people walk this path. Brilliant, sensitive individuals who started with legitimate gifts, legitimate perceptions, legitimate wounds, but they responded to misunderstanding with contempt rather than compassion. And decade by decade, they became more isolated, more bitter, more convinced of their superiority and everyone else's hopelessness. They end their lives alone, telling themselves it's because they were too evolved for this world. Never seeing that, they abandoned their own humanity in the name of protecting it. Danger 4. Self-betrayal and collapse. This is the opposite pathology from contemptuous withdrawal, but equally destructive. Instead of rejecting others, you reject yourself. Over and over and over, every time you're misunderstood, you fold. You apologize for who you are. You promise to be different. You contort yourself into whatever shape might finally be acceptable. You abandon your authentic expression, your true perception, your real self in the desperate hope that this time, if you just get it right, you'll finally be understood. You become a master shapeshifter, constantly reading the room and adjusting yourself accordingly. With family, you're the version of you they can handle. With colleagues, you're the professional persona they respect. With friends, you're the fun version they enjoy. With partners, you're whoever they need you to be. And you genuinely believe you're doing this to maintain relationships, to be loving, to meet others where they are. But really, you're engaging in chronic self-betrayal, abandoning yourself repeatedly in the false hope that the right performance will finally earn you belonging. Here's how you know you're in this pattern. You can't remember who you actually are. You've performed so many versions of yourself that your authentic self has become a dim memory, a ghost you occasionally sense in quiet moments but can't quite grasp. You feel exhausted all the time because self-betrayal is energetically expensive. You feel depressed but can't quite name why, because the depression is your psyche's grief over your self-abandonment. You feel anxious because you're constantly monitoring whether your current performance is acceptable. And eventually, you collapse. The collapse might look like a breakdown. Suddenly, you can't maintain the performance anymore. The masks crack. The false self shatters. You have what everyone calls a mental health crisis, but it's actually a spiritual emergency, your psyche's last-ditch attempt to force you back to yourself. Or the collapse might look like slow death. You maintain the performance, but something inside you dies. You become hollow, going through the motions, technically functional but spiritually gone. You look alive, but you're already dead inside. Jung saw both patterns. He saw patients who collapsed into acute crises that eventually led to breakthrough. And he saw patients who never collapsed, who maintained the false self until their actual death, having never lived their real life. The second group terrified him more, because at least the breakdown offers a chance at breakthrough. But the living death, maintaining the provisional life until you literally die, this is the ultimate tragedy. You get to the end and realize you never existed. You performed an entire life, but never actually lived. If you're in this pattern, here's what you need to hear. Every time you abandon yourself for others' comfort, you're not being loving, you're being cowardly. Every time you betray your truth for acceptance, you're not maintaining connection, you're preventing it, because the person they're accepting isn't you. Real connection requires risk. It requires showing yourself and tolerating the possibility of rejection. It requires saying, "This is who I am," and letting others decide if they can meet you there. Self-betrayal feels safer, but it guarantees the very isolation you're trying to avoid. Because even when people accept the false self you're performing, you know it's not really you they're accepting. So you remain fundamentally unseen, fundamentally alone, even in relationships. Danger. 5. Existential martyrdom. This is perhaps the most spiritually dangerous pathology because it disguises itself as meaning. You transform your misunderstanding into a cross you bear, a calling you've been given, a sacrifice you're making for some higher purpose. You tell yourself, "I'm meant to be misunderstood. It's my burden. Maybe I'm here to hold consciousness that others can't hold. Maybe my isolation is serving the collective in ways I can't see. Maybe my suffering has spiritual meaning." And here's the insidious part. Some of this might be true. Jung believed that individuated individuals do serve the collective by holding consciousness others can't yet access. Mystics, prophets, visionaries often are misunderstood because they're ahead of their time. But there's a massive difference between accepting misunderstanding as a temporary consequence of your authentic path and making misunderstanding your identity and purpose. The martyr doesn't just accept being misunderstood. They need it, they seek it, they unconsciously engineer situations that guarantee it. Why? Because their misunderstanding has become their claim to significance, their proof that they matter, their evidence that they're special. The martyr says things like, Someone has to hold this truth even if no one understands. My suffering is my offering. I'm the one willing to be rejected so others don't have to be. If I'm this misunderstood, I must be doing something important. They frame their isolation as service, their pain as spiritual practice, their inability to connect as noble solitude. They wear their misunderstanding like a crown of thorns, secretly proud of how much they're suffering for the sake of truth, consciousness, evolution. Jung warned explicitly against this pattern. He wrote, "The person who identifies with their suffering and calls it service has not integrated their shadow. They're using spiritual language to justify their psychological woundedness. The martyr's shadow is this: they're using their misunderstanding to avoid the actual hard work of relationships. They're using their special insights to feel superior while avoiding the humility of genuine connection. They're hiding behind their suffering instead of doing the work to become someone who can both hold their truth and maintain human bonds. Real service doesn't require your destruction. Real consciousness doesn't demand your isolation. Real integration doesn't mean sacrificing your humanity on the altar of your specialness." The martyr often quotes Jung's line about the privilege of becoming who you truly are, but they miss the second half of what he taught. Becoming who you truly are makes you more useful to the collective, not less. More connected, not less. More human, not less. If you're being destroyed by your path, if your misunderstanding is leading to complete isolation, if you're suffering without growth, you're not on the individuation path. You've wandered into martyrdom and you're calling it spirituality. The exit requires brutal honesty. Are you actually serving the collective with your suffering, or are you using service language to justify your inability to integrate? Are you actually holding important consciousness, or are you clinging to your specialness? Are you genuinely called to solitude, or are you afraid of the vulnerability required for connection? These 5 pathologies are real. They're not hypothetical warnings. Jung documented them. I've watched them destroy people. You've probably seen them in spiritual communities, psychological circles, creative spaces. Brilliant people who started on a genuine path and got lost in one of these traps. And here's what makes them so dangerous. Each one feels right when you're in it. Inflation feels like healthy self-recognition. The wounded healer trap feels like authentic service. Contemptuous withdrawal feels like necessary boundaries. Self-betrayal feels like love. Martyrdom feels like purpose. You can't see these patterns from inside them. You need external feedback, but you've likely surrounded yourself with people who either can't see the pattern or have the same pattern themselves. This is why Jung insisted that individuation isn't a solo journey. You need what he called the temenos, a sacred container, a relationship with someone who can see your blind spots. Not someone who'll validate your ego, but someone who'll challenge your shadow. The question you need to ask yourself right now, with brutal honesty, which of these pathologies are you flirting with? Where are you starting to veer off the path of integration into the path of destruction? Because here's the truth. These dangers aren't just possibilities, they're probabilities. Almost everyone walking the misunderstood to wholeness path will encounter at least one of these traps. Many will fall into multiple. Some will never get out. The difference between those who make it through and those who don't isn't that the successful ones avoid the dangers. It's that they catch themselves earlier, course-correct faster, maintain enough humility to see when they're drifting into pathology. But you can't course-correct if you don't know the course. You can't avoid the pitfalls if you don't have a map. You can't walk the path if you don't know what the path actually is. So let me show you. Let me give you Jung's actual framework, not the popularized version, not the watered-down self-help version, but the actual depth psychological process. he discovered through his own descent and his work with hundreds of patients. This is the individuation blueprint for the misunderstood, and it might be the most important thing you'll ever learn. Jung's framework for transformation wasn't theoretical. It was forged in the fire of his own near-psychotic breakdown, refined through decades of clinical work, and encoded in his later writings in language so dense that most people miss it. Let me translate it into practical steps. This is how you transform chronic misunderstanding from wound into wholeness. Step 1. Radical self-witnessing, developing the observing ego. The first and most crucial step is developing what Jung called the observing ego, the part of you that can witness your experience without being consumed by it. Here's why this matters. When you're chronically misunderstood, you're caught between two equally destructive positions. Either you collapse into doubt, maybe I am crazy, maybe they're right, or you inflate into certainty, I'm right, they're all blind. Both positions keep you trapped because both are ego identifications. In the first, your ego identifies with inadequacy. In the second, your ego identifies with superiority. And as long as your ego is identified with either position, you can't integrate. The observing ego is the part of you that can hold both truths simultaneously without collapsing into either extreme. It can say, I am genuinely perceiving something real that others aren't perceiving, and my perception triggers others' shadow material, which makes me incomprehensible to them. Notice the paradox. You're not wrong, but you're also not simply right, and they're wrong. You're operating in a different register of consciousness, and that difference creates inevitable misunderstanding. The observing ego can witness, right now I'm feeling the pain of being misunderstood, without adding, and that means I'm defective, or, and that means they're unconscious. It simply observes the experience without the narrative that makes it into identity. Here's how to develop this capacity. Daily practice of what Jung called active reflection. At the end of each day, you review moments when you felt misunderstood, not to justify yourself, not to rehearse arguments, but to observe the pattern. Ask yourself, what was I trying to communicate? How was it received? Where was the disconnect? What was triggered in me? What might have been triggered in them? What did I make it mean about myself? What did I make it mean about them? You're not trying to figure out who was right. You're trying to see the entire dynamic from a position that transcends ego. You're developing the capacity to witness yourself from the outside while feeling yourself from the inside. This is the foundation. Without the observing ego, every other step will devolve into ego defense. With it, you can navigate the rest of the process. Step 2. Shadow integration of the misunderstood. Owning your weaponization. This step requires more courage than most people can muster. You have to look at the ways you've weaponized being misunderstood, used it manipulatively, hidden behind it to avoid accountability. Your ego will resist this viciously. Wait, I'm the victim here. They're the ones misunderstanding me. How dare you suggest I'm using this? But Jung was uncompromising about this. Everything has shadow. Every authentic position also gets used inauthentically. Every genuine wound also becomes a manipulation. And if you can't see your own shadow in this dynamic, you're not individuating. You're just creating a spiritual ego. So let's look at the shadow of being chronically misunderstood. How have you used it to avoid accountability? You're criticizing me because you don't understand me, not because I actually did something harmful. How many times have you dismissed valid feedback by claiming the person just doesn't get you? How often have you used your complexity as a shield against simple truths, like you hurt someone or you made a mistake? Claim superiority? I'm misunderstood because I'm more conscious, sensitive, awake than they are. Be honest, how much does your identity depend on being special because you're misunderstood? How often do you feel a secret satisfaction when others don't understand you because it confirms your uniqueness? Avoid intimacy. No one can really know me, so why try? How convenient is it that being chronically misunderstood means you never have to risk genuine vulnerability? How often have you used your complexity as a reason not to try to communicate clearly? Maintain victim identity? My life is hard because people don't understand me. What problems in your life are you attributing to being misunderstood that actually have other causes? Where are you using misunderstanding as an excuse for not taking responsibility? Get attention. Look how deep, complex, interesting I am. How much of your self-presentation is designed to ensure you remain fascinating and incomprehensible? How much are you performing your otherness? This shadow work is excruciating. It requires admitting that even your most legitimate pain has been used illegitimately. Even your most authentic experience has been performed strategically. Even your deepest truth has been weaponized for ego purposes. But Jung insisted, until you own your shadow, you can't integrate. Until you see where you've manipulated the dynamic, you can't transform it. Until you admit how you've used your misunderstanding, you can't move beyond it. The practice is simple but brutal. For 1 month, every time you feel misunderstood, ask yourself, how am I benefiting from this misunderstanding? What don't I have to do or be or face if they don't understand me? Don't let yourself off the hook. Your ego will produce 1,000 justifications. Push past them. Find the shadow. Own it. Step 3. Differentiation without disconnection, the middle path. This is where most people fail. They either fuse with others, abandoning self for connection, or cut off from others, maintaining self through isolation. Jung's genius was recognizing there's a third option, differentiation. Differentiation means I can be fully myself while remaining emotionally connected to you. I can disagree without rejecting you. I can hold my truth without requiring you to validate it. I can be misunderstood by you without collapsing or attacking. This sounds simple. It's the hardest psychological work there is. Here's why. Differentiation requires tolerating others' anxiety about you without trying to manage it. When you stop performing the false self, when you show your authentic complexity, people get anxious, and their anxiety comes at you as concern, criticism, confusion, or rejection. Your nervous system registers their anxiety and immediately wants to do something about it. Either collapse back into performing what they can handle, or defend yourself against their reaction. Both are forms of fusion. You're still letting their emotional state determine yours. Differentiation means I can sense your anxiety about who I'm being, and I can stay myself anyway, not aggressively, not defensively, just calmly remaining myself while you feel what you feel about it. Jung taught his patients a revolutionary phrase. I understand you see it differently. That's it. Not, let me explain again so you'll understand. Not, you're wrong and here's why. Not, fine, I'll change. Just, I understand you see it differently. This phrase does something miraculous. It acknowledges their reality without abandoning yours. It creates space for difference without turning difference into conflict. It maintains connection without requiring agreement. Practice this in low-stakes situations first. Someone misunderstands your intention. Instead of over-explaining or defending, try, I understand you heard it that way. I meant it differently, and I understand that's not what landed. Notice what happens. Most people de-escalate because you're not fighting them. You're not requiring them to change their perception. You're just stating that two different perceptions exist, and that's okay. Over time, this practice builds the capacity for differentiation. You can maintain yourself while staying in relationship. You can be yourself without needing everyone to understand you. You can let others be confused or concerned or critical without either convincing them or cutting them off. This is the middle path Jung pointed to. Not fusion, I abandoned myself to maintain connection. Not cut off, I abandoned connection to maintain myself. But differentiation, I remain myself and I remain connected, holding both without sacrificing either. Step 4. Finding your symbolic order, creating personal meaning systems. Here's something most people miss about Jung's work. He wasn't trying to help people fit into collective meaning systems. He was teaching them to create their own. The collective offers ready-made meaning: religion, ideology, culture, family myths. These frameworks tell you who you are, what matters, how to interpret your experience, and they work perfectly for people whose inner experience matches the collective template. But if you're chronically misunderstood, your inner experience doesn't match the template. You're experiencing things the collective framework can't account for. You're feeling things it says you shouldn't feel. You're seeing things it insists aren't real. So you have two options. Keep trying to force your experience into frameworks that don't fit, or create your own symbolic order. This is what Jung did during his Red Book years. The psychoanalytic framework couldn't contain his experiences. Christian theology couldn't explain what he was encountering. Academic psychology had no language for the numinous realm he'd accessed. So he created his own symbolic vocabulary. He painted images, he wrote dialogues with inner figures. He developed a personal mythology that could hold his experiences without reducing them to pathology or inflating them to enlightenment. This is what you must do, not to reject collective meaning systems entirely, but to develop your own symbolic order that can hold what they can't. For the mystic, this might mean creating private rituals that honor your numinous experiences without claiming they're universal truths. For the truth speaker, it might mean developing an ethical framework that explains why honesty matters to you, independent of whether others agree. For the creative deviant, it might mean building a personal aesthetic philosophy that validates your vision. For the deep feeler, it might mean developing an emotional cosmology that makes sense of your intensity. The practice Jung recommended is active imagination, engaging with your inner world as if it's real and has its own intelligence. Not just thinking about your experiences, but dialoguing with them. You might write letters to parts of yourself that feel misunderstood, letting them respond in their own voice. You might paint or draw the symbols that appear in your dreams without trying to interpret them intellectually. You might have imaginal conversations with archetypal figures who represent different aspects of your psyche. The goal isn't to create a system others will understand. It's to create a symbolic order that helps you understand yourself. Once you have that, once you have your own internal meaning-making capacity, others' inability to understand becomes far less destabilizing. You're not depending on external validation because you've developed internal validation. You have your own symbolic vocabulary, your own meaning system, your own relationship with the deeper layers of psyche. Step 5. The transcendent function, holding the tension. This is Jung's most sophisticated concept, and it's the key to transformation. The transcendent function is the psyche's ability to hold opposites in tension until a third thing emerges, something that transcends the original binary. In your case, the opposites are my authentic inner experience and others' perception of me. These feel mutually exclusive. Being truly yourself seems to require others misunderstanding you. Being understood seems to require abandoning your authentic self. Most people collapse one pole or the other. They either kill their authentic self to be understood, or they reject all connection to maintain their authenticity. But Jung discovered, if you can hold both poles in consciousness simultaneously, without trying to resolve the tension prematurely, a third possibility emerges. Not compromise. I'll be a little less myself, so I'm a little more understood. but transcendence, a more complex self that can exist in both registers. Here's how it works. You sit with the unbearable tension. You feel the pain of being genuinely yourself and being genuinely misunderstood. You don't try to fix it. You don't try to choose one or the other. You just hold both truths. I am authentically expressing my experience, and they are genuinely unable to receive it. Both true, neither wrong, just incompatible at the current level of consciousness. And if you can stay in that tension without collapsing, without explaining, without defending, without abandoning, something shifts. A new way of being emerges that wasn't available before. Maybe you discover you can express your authentic experience in a simpler register without losing its essence. Maybe you realize some people genuinely can't understand you, and that's okay because you're not performing for everyone. Maybe you find that being understood isn't what you actually need. Being witnessed is. The transcendent function doesn't give you a formula. It gives you a more complex, more nuanced version of yourself that can navigate the paradox. You become simultaneously more yourself and more relatable, more differentiated and more connected, more unique and more universal. Jung said this process can't be forced. You have to wait in the tension, hold the opposites, trust that the psyche has an intelligence that will produce a third option you couldn't have conceived rationally. This is why most people fail at individuation. They can't tolerate the tension. They need to resolve it immediately. They jump to solutions, make decisions, take action, anything to escape the unbearable middle space where nothing is resolved. But the middle space is where transformation happens. Jung called it the temenos, the alchemical vessel where opposites are held until they transform into something new. Your practice is this. When you feel the pain of misunderstanding, don't try to fix it. Sit with it. Feel both truths. Hold the tension. Trust that something is trying to emerge that you can't yet see. These 5 steps aren't linear. You don't complete one and move to the next. You cycle through them repeatedly at deeper levels throughout your life. But together they form the actual individuation process Jung was describing, not the Americanized self-help version of be yourself and manifest your dreams, but the depth psychological work of becoming whole in a world that rewards fragmentation. This work is hard, it's slow, it's not glamorous. You won't see immediate results. You'll question whether it's working. You'll want to quit. But Jung was clear. This is the only path that leads to genuine wholeness. Everything else is just managing symptoms, performing wellness, or creating a spiritual ego that looks integrated but is actually inflated. The question is, are you willing to do the actual work? Because history shows us what happens to those who try to shortcut this process, and what happens to those who walk it with consciousness and humility.